Hello, welcome, and thanks for joining me for another book chat. Let's spend a few minutes with Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. This book was originally published back in 2014, and I read an electronic edition. This book was also a finalist for the National Book Award for Fiction that year, which is pretty cool. So I heard about this author at the beginning of the year. I was reading this article about anticipated books coming out in the first half of 2020, and this author had a book has a book that just came out actually called The Glass Hotel. And so when I was reading up on that, I saw that she had also written this book about Station 11, which sort of sounded really interesting to me. And then I was doing one of the great courses, one of those electronic courses, and I was doing a course on utopias and dystopias, and this book was talked about during the course. And even though we're in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, I decided to go ahead and give this book a read, even though it also pertains to a major pandemic, a global pandemic called the Georgia flu. So we'll get more into that here in a bit. But so as the book opens, it's in Toronto, and we're at a theater where there is a production of King Lear. And so this particular production of King Lear is kind of an unusual production. It's got children, 3 little girls at the very beginning of the play, sort of symbolically. They don't have speaking parts, but they're symbolically representing the 3 sisters, of King Lear, who are in the play later on as grown adults. But so this play is underway, and the star of the play, playing King Lear, his name is Arthur Leander. He's a well-known actor. And during the course of the play, he starts having a heart attack. And then one of the audience members, whose name is Jeevan, sort of sitting in the front of the, I don't know if on the front row, but very in front of the, right in front of the stage, recognizes what's going on with him and rushes up to the stage to try to help him, because apparently he's had some paramedic training. Well, the actor actually dies, and so this Jeevan, in the process of all this, he was there with his girlfriend. He has this sort of troubled relationship with his girlfriend. So when all this sort of activity is over, he goes out. His girlfriend has left, and so he's sort of at the theater alone. He goes out and wanders out in the out and decides to go for a walk, because he just had an epiphany. So as he's working on trying to save Arthur Leander's life, this actor's life, he realized what he wanted to do with his life, and that was be a paramedic. He realized then suddenly his life suddenly got a focus, because historically his life had not had a focus, and he sort of had wandered aimlessly from job to job. And so he was thrilled about this. Well, he eventually gets this call. He's wandering around in Toronto, and the snowstorm has started, and he gets this call from a friend of his who's a doctor at a hospital. And the friend of his says, you need to get out of town. You need to get out of the city as quick as possible. I'm calling everybody that I know to let them know this Georgia flu is here. There's this plane that has come in from Russia, Georgia, the Republic of Georgia. We've had X number of deaths already, and I've never seen such a fast transmission rate, and it has a very high mortality. Every single patient so far has died, so you need to get out of the city. And so he's like, okay. So he's trying to decide, should I go to my girlfriend's or back home, or he wants to go visit his brother who lives nearby, who is a paraplegic. Well, so he's sort of wandering around still, and his friend calls back again and says, no, I'm serious. You need to get out of Toronto. And his friend's already coughing and things like that. So this Jeevan, he goes to there's a corner store right by his brother's apartment, and he goes and starts binge buying like lots and lots of food and supplies and things like that. And the clerk there is just sort of like, they're about to close, and she's like not really realizing, like what's going on, and thinking he's kind of crazy. But he takes all his food and goes to his brother's. Well, in the meantime, this little girl, so the play is over, and this little girl, one of the little girls who has been in the play, her parents have not picked her up, and so she's just sort of there. She's got this woman that's there sort of minding, that was there, her job was really to mind the child actors, and she's there with her, and she gives her this paperweight and says, here, look at this pretty thing, and gives her this paperweight to hold while she's waiting on her parents to, or while she's trying to reach her parents or reach someone to pick up this little girl. So that's how the story opens. So the story opens with this play, and then it really divulges then into two separate storylines after this. So we go 20 years into the future where there is a band of musicians and actors called the Traveling Symphony. And then we also sort of divulge back into the life of Arthur Leander, the actor who died, during this production of King Lear on the very first day of the pandemic. And so the Traveling Symphony is a symphony. They are in Michigan, the area once known as Michigan. It's 20 years in the future, so we discover that the pandemic had a very high mortality rate and civilization has come to a complete halt. There's very few people left. I did learn through reading the book, though, that not everybody got the flu, so some people managed to avoid getting it, and then there were some that had a 1% that had a natural immunity. So, but roughly, 99 or something percent of the people didn't make it. But this Traveling Symphony travels around from town to town, and they perform Shakespeare and symphonic music. They're a symphony. And the cool thing about this Traveling Symphony, one of the cool things about it, I thought, was that they call each other a lot of times by their, especially the musicians, call each other by their names, like the flutes, the first cello or the third violin. Their leader is called the conductor. The leader is she's the conductor of the symphony. And then there are also the actors who primarily do Shakespeare. And their motto, they have this traveling caravan, and their motto on the side of their caravan is called "Survival is Insufficient," has been painted on their caravan, and more about that here in a bit. Survival is insufficient. So this former child actress, her name is Kirsten. She's one of the actresses of the Traveling Symphony, and she actually also has it tattooed on her arm, "Survival is insufficient." And so they go from town to town. So going from town to town, we understand we get an idea of what life is like, at this time, 20 years in the future. It's year 20. They started out with year 0, the year of the pandemic. And so Kirsten now is a young woman. She can't even remember. So she was 8 years old at the first day of the pandemic, the day of the Arthur Leander died during King Lear. And so she can't even remember the first year after the pandemic because, of course, it was kind of chaos. But then she still has that paperweight. So she carries this paperweight with her, all the time. And then, I guess I mentioned our other storyline is this backstory of Arthur Leander and sort of what brought him to that point of the day of the play. So it's, in a way, Arthur Leander and this cast of characters from before the pandemic, all that revolve around Arthur, are sort of counting down to the pandemic. And then from the pandemic then forward, we have Kirsten, the Traveling Symphony, and others. So I want to be real careful not to give away anything that I think would detract from the reading of the book. So I'm being real careful to not divulge any spoilers. But I did want to talk about the prophet. So there is a character called the prophet. So one thing that we learn from the Traveling Symphony that goes from town to town is that with an apocalyptic book like this, one thing apocalyptic books can do is they strip away everything and just leave the bare bones sometimes of humanity. So we get to really see really clearly some aspects of humanity. And so one thing that's happened now is because the population is so low, in even just little small towns, in between them, little small towns have their own culture, and they go different directions, and they might be quite different from one another. And so this one town has been taken over by someone called the prophet, and he has kind of a cultish following of in sort of religion. And so there's this is sort of a, I don't want to say bad guy, but he is a person who figures very prominently in the story without giving too much away. All right, so I don't want to divulge too much else about what goes on in the story, about what their ultimate journey winds up being, and how it all turns out, who lives and who doesn't through the pandemic. I don't really want to give any of that away because that was part of the really the sort of the page turning aspect of the story. Although this is a really I think it's really a sort of meditative look at an apocalypse. It's not really Like there's not a lot of violence and things like this that sometimes you get in apocalypse books. It's really more meditative about the human condition and what life would be like things lost. And so more about that here in a bit. So to the motto of the motto of the symphony that I mentioned, survival is insufficient, that comes from a Star Trek episode. It is season 6, episode 2 of Star Trek Voyager, and 7 of 9 says the word survival is insufficient. I went back and watched this episode, and this episode is really relevant to the storyline because it pertains to 7 of 9. If you know the story of 7 of 9 as a Borg, and so she's assimilated into this alien culture as a child, and so she adapts differently than some people who were assimilated as adults, and that's what this episode is about, and also this book is about this. So people who were adults at the time of the pandemic have a different reaction to the children or people who were very young, because one of the common themes of this story is remembrance. And is the past real? Am I remembering the past real? Because as time goes by and our memories become more dim, especially when things are really alien, like one of the characters wonders did refrigerators really have lights in them? You know, they're trying to, she was a young girl, so she didn't really remember. She was wondering if she was remembering that correctly. So the former world, so the one thing about this apocalyptic book like this, you know, their world, so our world that we recognize is disintegrating all around them, right? Because the houses, the cities are disintegrating and things like that. Artifacts are being lost. But if you think about it, really all of our pasts are always disintegrating behind us, regardless. This is one of the examples of how an apocalyptic book like this can really strip away and leave us with something really human. And that is how our pasts are always disintegrating behind us. It's not necessarily due to an apocalypse. We can see it really clearly when it's outlined in its apocalyptic manner, but nevertheless, it's happening. It's really happening to all of us. And then I'm going to run out of time, but another thing I wanted to mention was, you know, we have this saying that everything happens for a reason. You know, you hear this a lot, and it's a comfort to many people. Everything does not always happen for a reason, and people in this novel who think that it didn't always turn out so well if they think there was a reason behind the apocalypse. You know, sometimes horrible things just happen. Sometimes things just happen. So before I run out of time, I did want to read a quote from the book because I thought it was really cool. This quote pertains to a friend of Arthur Leander's who winds up being a fairly major character in the book. So Arthur Leander's is the actor that dies during the King Lear production at the beginning of the book. His friend, Clark, is on his way to Toronto, but his flight is diverted because of the pandemic has broken out, and so his flight is diverted, and this is what's going on for this quote. So he says, or he doesn't say, but the book says, so the quote says, "He had lost his oldest friend, but if the television news was accurate, then in all probability everyone here with him in the airport had lost someone too. All at once he felt an aching tenderness for his fellow refugees, these 100 or so strangers here in the airport. He folded his paper and looked at them, his compatriots, sleeping or fretfully awake on benches and on carpets, pacing, staring at screens, or out at the landscape of airplanes and snow. Everyone waiting for whatever came next." I thought that was really pretty because that's really like life in general, not necessarily an apocalypse, but, you know, everybody's really just sort of waiting to see what's going to happen next in their life. But I thought that was kind of a beautiful meditation on this sort of theme of this book. So anyway, I'm out of time. My next book chat is going to be Death in Venice and 7 Other Stories by Thomas Mann. I have already finished this. I actually damaged my paperback when I was reading, but I will have a chat on this coming up in the very near future. So until next time, take care. Bye.